Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackson Cote. I'm a breaking trending reporter with MassLive. I'm here today with Kade Crockford, the director of the Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts, to talk about an issue that has become more and more prevalent here in the Commonwealth and that I've been reporting on for the past few months, and that's facial recognition technology. It's a form of surveillance that uses artificial intelligence to try to identify a face from an image. But the software comes with its controversies. It's been widely criticized for its potential to violate civil liberties and personal privacies. And the tech has been proven to frequently misidentify individuals, particularly people of color. Kade, thanks for joining me today to talk about this issue. How are things going at the ACLU right now?
Busy as always. Thanks for having me.
I'm sure right now. Now, you've been spearheading efforts for quite some time to make the public more aware of the dangers surrounding facial recognition and have been successful working to get the software banned at the municipal level. And, every time I report on this issue or read about this issue, I think I'm in 1984, but, it's not fiction, it's reality. First, can you explain to me just in simple terms how this technology works? How does the software use artificial intelligence and surveillance to recognize the identities of people's faces?
So face surveillance technology uses algorithms that measure the distance between points on people's faces. So for example, the distance between my eyes, the distance between my eyes and my nose, et cetera, to create what are called face prints or templates. And these templates are basically a series of numbers. They're not actually, if you were to look at them, it would just look like a string of numbers and it wouldn't make any sense to you. But computers can understand that series of numbers basically as, we do looking at someone's face. As you said, though, they sometimes make mistakes. Frequently make mistakes, especially for people of color. So these algorithms that are they are trained to basically analyze images and compare those face prints against one another. And so they do that using images, for example, in driver's license databases. The state of Massachusetts has a facial recognition program in their registry of motor vehicles system, so that every time you go to get a driver's license now, the picture that is taken of your face is scanned against all of the existing images that they have in the database. The face print is created of the photo that was taken of you for your license, and face prints already exist, templates already exist in this database for every image that's in there. And they basically compare them to see if there's a match. And if there is a match, you may be investigated for trying to get a driver's license under a fake name or something like that. So that's initially why the RMV got that system. But the technology can also be used to try to identify people in images, like, for example, taken from surveillance cameras or social media images. Say somebody posts something on Twitter and the government wants to know who is that person. They can take that person's profile image, load it into a facial recognition system, which will create a face print or a template of that person's face using that image, and then compare that unknown person's face template to a database of known or labeled images, like, for example, a driver's license database, to try to perform an identification. There's another way that the technology can be used as well, which is to actually try to track people's movements in time and people's associations across time. So that is when the technology is used to analyze video data. So you've probably seen something like this in the film Minority Report, for example, where you could enter someone's face print, my face print, into a computer and say, okay, computer, tell me anytime you see this face print out anywhere on the streets on one of the video camera, through video camera surveillance anywhere in Boston, for example. And then the technology would, we just saw Kade or someone with this face print walk past a camera on Boylston Street downtown, and the police get an automatic alert about that. So that's one of the actually most pernicious forms of face surveillance technology that we're most concerned about, is the ability to basically analyze large quantities of video data to enable the mass tracking and cataloging of people's public movements, habits, and associations. And that's not just for one person on one day, but that's for really every person on all days.
That's a lot of surveillance. And you've mentioned to me before that there are sort of three primary concerns surrounding facial recognition technology. I think you've touched on some of them, but could you explain to me what those concerns are? And can you also explain to me how this technology can, as so many people have argued and has been sort of proven, how it can be racist, how it can be racially biased?
Yes. So face surveillance technology is dangerous, as you said, for three core reasons. Sorry, I literally just spilled my coffee all over my table.
No worries at all.
One is that the technology is completely unregulated in not only in Massachusetts, but actually across the country and in most parts of the world.
Mhm.
So there is not a single law on the books in Massachusetts or at the federal level that tells the government, or for that matter, private entities, how they can use face surveillance technologies. And obviously, you know, in an environment in which people are protesting police injustice and racism against Black people, that is a significant issue, because for too long, what we've seen is that police departments really just adopt these technologies in secret without any public debate, without any rules to govern their use, and without the sufficient accountability and oversight mechanisms that would actually make it possible to enforce those rules. Obviously, that's a problem. So the first thing is that they're totally unregulated. The second thing is that these technologies don't work very well in many cases. So there have been numerous studies, including studies coming out of MIT right here in Boston, in Massachusetts, really critical work by leading Black scholars, including Joy Buolamwini, Timnit Gebru, and Deb Raji, who found that face surveillance algorithms tend to perform more poorly when examining the faces specifically of darker skinned women and of people with dark skin generally. So that was some landmark path-breaking research that was done a few years ago initially. And following that, the field of what's called algorithmic bias research has really exploded. We've also seen even the federal government do some studies looking at this. So the National Institute for Standards and Technology, which is a independent, nonpartisan federal government body that looks at technology, found in a report that they released in December of last year that they looked at about 190 of these face recognition algorithms, and they found that overwhelmingly, these systems have a much more difficult time properly classifying the faces of darker skinned people, women, but not just women and darker skinned people. They also found that these systems were bad at evaluating the faces of children and the elderly. So what that tells us is that they're really only good at evaluating the faces of middle-aged white men, which obviously is not the majority of the population.
So the very slim group of people.
That's right. So the second issue is that the tech is just not ready for prime time, not even close. And the third issue is that even if the technology were ready for prime time, and frankly, even if there were some regulations governing its use, this technology poses truly unprecedented threats to our privacy, our civil rights, to racial justice, and really opens up the door for us to live in a society where every single place we go in public, our habits, associations, and activities are documented and cataloged on an automated basis forever. So every time you go to a cannabis shop, your face gets clocked. Every time you walk into a mosque or a church, the camera outside is clocking your attendance. Every time you walk down the street with a friend or maybe someone you're having an affair with, that is clocked and cataloged by the government in secret. Every time you want to maybe play hooky and go to the beach during a pandemic and you maybe don't want people to know that you're doing that, that activity is cataloged and clocked and monitored. And that just creates way too much information for the government to be able to exploit, to use against people who want to go to political protests without the government keeping tabs on them, against people who may want to get an abortion without, their coworkers or the police knowing about it. There are some communities in the country right now where the government is trying to outlaw something like abortion. And so it really creates this world of kind of perfect surveillance that directly threatens our First Amendment rights to freedom of speech and freedom of association, and frankly, just our right to be left alone and our right to be able to walk around in our community without worrying that every step we take, every move we make, we're being tracked by the police.
That's scary stuff. And last summer, the ACLU of Massachusetts started its Press Pause on Face Surveillance campaign. You're wearing the T-shirt, I see. You know, trying to bring the issue, make the public more aware of it, and the worries surrounding the technology and the need for it to be regulated. Because right now, as you mentioned, it remains largely unregulated. However, on the municipal level, like I mentioned before, the technology has been either outright or temporarily banned by 7 Massachusetts communities, East Hampton most recently, and before that, Boston, which was sort of historic because it was the largest city east of San Francisco to ban facial recognition technology, at least at the municipal level. How significant is that? How significant is Boston and other communities in Massachusetts banning this software?
It's hugely significant. I mean, you know, we've seen unanimous votes in city councils from, you know, Western Mass in Northampton to Eastern Massachusetts in Boston. City councilors have agreed that this technology poses really an unprecedented threat to people's privacy and civil rights. And I think that the movement that you're seeing here in Massachusetts, where we've, as you said, passed 7 of these bans, in California, which has passed 4 at the municipal level, starting in San Francisco, which was the first city in the world to do this and is the largest city. Boston is the second to take this step. What you're seeing is that communities are increasingly realizing that state legislatures are slow to act. Those are complex bodies that involve a lot of push and pull from many different forces. It's not as direct a forum for democracy as, for example, a municipal city council or town meeting, like we have in Brookline, for example, which passed a ban last year. This, even in Congress, is obviously a much more complex place for people to play in terms of policy, especially for community advocates and people with less institutional power. But where we really do have power is at the local level. And it just so happens that local police also are the ones who would be using this technology to the greatest detriment of people's privacy and civil rights in the United States. You know, obviously FBI can use this technology, you know, the Drug Enforcement Administration, but those federal law enforcement agencies, and even to some degree the state police here in Massachusetts, really do depend on municipal police departments who are running the surveillance camera networks that you see in the streets all around your communities. Those are owned and controlled by the local police. And so both for those, you know, infrastructural reasons having to do with the technology itself being under the control of the local municipality, and because we actually have more power at the local level, we can mobilize people to put enough political pressure on city councilors to take a step that may initially seem radical like this in a way that it's more difficult to move state legislatures or certainly Congress. And as a result of that, we have seen incredible movement in this space that, you know, 7 communities in Massachusetts have done this, and it's not merely symbolic. It actually has a huge impact on people's privacy rights, again, because it is those local police controlled by these ordinances who would be doing the bulk of this surveillance in the first place. So we're really excited to see the momentum here. This is a movement. It's not a moment. You know, 7 communities have done it in Mass, 4 in California. Every day it feels I'm fielding calls from city councilors from other parts of the state who want to take on this issue in their communities. So we're not going to stop. We're going to continue until every single person in Massachusetts is protected. And I'll just close by saying that the state legislature is finally taking notice. You know, one of the impacts that we've seen from these municipal bans and the movement to pass these bans at the municipal level is that the state legislature is finally realizing that they need to do something too. So in the Senate bill that is actually being debated, was debated briefly yesterday and will be debated again on Monday, on police reform issues, there is something in that bill which pauses. It basically creates a temporary moratorium on all statewide law enforcement use of this technology until December 31st, 2021. We would really like to see the Senate remove that set so that the moratorium stays in place until the legislature can authorize some regulations to deal with this technology. But regardless, we're happy to see that, and we're looking forward to the House to include something like a moratorium or a face surveillance ban in their legislation as well.
Yeah, and when we're talking about some of these local communities that have, you know, banned the technology at a municipal level, we're talking about San Francisco, we're talking about Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, and you pointed this out to me before, but some of these communities, many of these communities that I just mentioned are technology hubs, and may have residents who are, more aware of some of the issues surrounding facial recognition. Could you get into that a little bit?
Yeah, it's not a surprise at all, in my view, that San Francisco is the first community in the country to do this. Look, these are people who work in the tech industry. They know better than anyone, first of all, how dangerous this technology is when it works and when it doesn't, right? A lot of people, I think, in the public who don't work in machine learning or who don't have a tech background can think, maybe because of TV shows, cop shows have given us this notion that that a lot of these technologies are magic, that they always work, right? They always catch the bad guy, and at the end of the episode, it's just a nice, clean wrap up, and we can all feel good about ourselves. Well, that's not how the real world works in a variety of ways. First of all, the technology does not always work. And second, we know damn well the cops aren't always the good guys. And that is something that I think people who have access to elite institutions and knowledge of computer science and things like machine learning really understand. The first piece, that the technology is not perfect and can make mistakes. And also that when the technology works, it's actually quite dangerous. People who work in information science have a very firm grasp of the simple maxim that knowledge is power, right? Librarians understand that, historians understand it, and I think people who work in tech understand it too. And they don't want the government to have all of that power, right? To have the power to see everything that you're doing always, all the time. And so, yeah, I don't think it's an accident at all that it's very, very tech dominant cities like San Francisco, like Cambridge, like Boston, like Somerville, that have been the first in the nation to do this. They're effectively saying, I know what this technology does and what it's capable of, and I don't want this used on me and my family, in my community. And that should send a very strong message to the rest of the country about what we ought to do about this technology.
And facial recognition technology, it's been around for quite some time now, and it's been abused in other countries and right here in the United States. One of the most well-known abusers of the software is China, a country that has used facial recognition for months, but has recently now boosted it in an effort to fight the spread of the coronavirus. There have been instances of this technology unfairly targeting people of color and misidentifying individuals here in the US, and a significant number of individuals don't even know that it's happening. Can you tell me about the recent case of Robert Williams in Michigan, who is, a legitimate example of this technology's racial bias?
Yeah, I mean, it's just awful what happened to Mr. Williams and his family. So this is a father of two. He has two young daughters. In January, he was shocked to find Detroit police officers blocking him in his driveway when he was trying to go to work in the morning. These cops arrested him in front of his two small children and his wife. He's a black man, and took him down to the Detroit police station and basically said, you're being charged with robbery, with robbing this like high-end boutique in downtown Detroit. And he said, what are you talking about? I definitely didn't do that. So they showed him a picture from a surveillance camera. And this is a really important part of the story. Very grainy surveillance camera image from the store of a large framed black man. Mr. Williams, certainly fits that description. And Mr. Williams looked at the picture and he said, this definitely isn't me. And he held it up to his face and he said, I hope you don't think all black men look alike. And this is really key. The police looked at each other and they said, oh, I guess the computer must have made a mistake. That is a critical part of the story, because if they hadn't said that, Robert Williams would not know why he was wrongfully arrested. And that's what we're seeing in Massachusetts, in states across the country, is that police departments are conducting searches of facial recognition systems using very poor quality probe images, like that surveillance camera still from that store in Detroit. And then they're using the identifications that come from those searches to arrest and prosecute people. And unlike the case of Mr. Williams, in the vast majority of those circumstances, the people who are arrested and charged as a result of those face recognition searches are never told that facial recognition was used to identify them in that case. That is a massive due process problem. It's actually a crisis. It's a constitutional crisis that's happening here in Massachusetts and across the country, Because effectively, I mean, think about it like this. The one thing that cop shows get right, think about Law and Order. If somebody is a witness in a criminal prosecution, the defense attorney has an opportunity to put that person on the stand and say, how are your eyes? When did you last get, your eyes checked? Do your glasses function appropriately? Maybe you have some racial animus. Are you sure you saw my client where you said you did? That is a crucial part of the process of the process that affords people due process rights in the United States to be able to interrogate your witness. What we're seeing with facial recognition here in Massachusetts and across the country is that people are being accused by a digital witness, this is the facial recognition technology, of having committed a crime, and yet police are deliberately shielding information about that digital witness from the criminal defendant, so they don't even have the opportunity to ask questions of that technical system. Does the algorithm have racial bias issues? When you perform the search, did you get other images in addition to my clients in return? And if so, who are those people? Where were they at the time of the incident? So the Robert Williams story is really important for a bunch of reasons. One is that it shows very clearly that this technology is particularly dangerous to Black people who have for a long time been disproportionately the targets of police surveillance and harassment. The second is that the technology doesn't work very well. And that was clearly the case here, where he was fingered by the system as being a man he was not. He was arrested. He was detained for 30 hours. He had to pay like $1,000 bond to get out. His children are traumatized as a result of this. They now play cops and robbers, and they say that their dad is the robber, and they try to arrest him and stuff. I mean, it clearly was very upsetting for his family. The third thing about it is that this is not a unique situation. So the Detroit police chief, in response to this story coming out, actually said that 96% of the time when the Detroit police uses this technology to try to identify someone, the technology gets it wrong. 96% of the time. The police chief himself said that. He also said, crucially, that of the 70 or so searches that the Detroit police has conducted using facial recognition technology in recent months, 68 of those people were Black. So this technology is inherently racially biased because of the problems with the algorithms themselves. And as the Detroit example shows, as we know about a variety of police surveillance programs, from street level stop and frisk all the way to drug warrants and things like that, police are disproportionately focusing their attention with respect to surveillance on Black and brown people. And that is going to happen with this technology as well. It is already happening behind the scenes in secret. And it's a real crisis here in Massachusetts and across the country.
Mm-hmm. And right now, are there any appropriate or positive uses for this technology? I mean, I mentioned right before that China is using it to try to, curb the coronavirus crisis there. But are there any appropriate uses for this software?
Certainly, there are no appropriate uses for the software in its current form. The government should not be using technology that is inherently racially biased, full stop, period. So until the technology improves substantially, until the state legislature here in Massachusetts promulgates very clear rules and regulations requiring judicial oversight for the rare use of the technology, it should not be used, period. It is way too dangerous. We know that due process violations have been occurring in secret. And frankly, some things ought to be banned permanently. So the idea that in the year 2050, it would be acceptable for police departments here in Boston, in Cambridge, in Somerville, in Springfield, across the country, to have networks of smart surveillance cameras that enable police officers to automatically identify and track every single person's public movements, habits, and associations. It's just too much power. It's way too much, and actually will pose safety and security threats that far exceed any possible benefit that they would provide to the public. We have to remember that police officers are human beings. They break the law, they violate the rules just like everybody else, and in some cases more than other people. Just today, or yesterday, this week, Department of Justice, this is Bill Barr's Department of Justice, not exactly a very civil rights friendly administration, put out a scathing report about the Springfield Police Department's narcotics unit, showing that those police officers have beaten people, have yelled racist expletives at children who they are subjecting to beatings, have threatened to plant evidence on people. Maybe they've actually planted evidence and guns on people, but certainly have threatened it and been caught doing that. So, when we think about whether we want to hand a basically godlike system of power and surveillance over to a government agency, we have to think about the history of that government agency. And the reality is that in the United States, police have been a force of systemic racism and brutality for a very long time in this country, up to the present. And so when we think about questions like safety, when we're talking about surveillance, we really need to ask, whose safety are we talking about? And with respect to face surveillance and technologies that are in the hands of the police, we're really not talking about technologies that are going to enhance the safety, particularly of communities that have long been targeted by the police: Black and brown people, immigrants, the poor, homeless people, drug users, etc.
Mm-hmm. And a big part of this issue, which you've talked with me about, is the companies, not the police departments, the companies that try to sell this software to local police departments. And you've described it for me in the past that these companies have behaved in sort of predatory manner. And just to give you an example of this happening right here in Massachusetts, this state's chapter of the ACLU reported that a Cambridge-based surveillance company by the name of Suspect Technologies had been trying to get the Plymouth Police Department to adopt their surveillance software. What makes these companies' behavior predatory, and why are they, for a lack of a better word, targeting local police departments?
Well, these companies are predatory because they're trying to make money off of dystopian surveillance that in many cases doesn't even work, and that they acknowledge functions very poorly. So the emails that you're talking about are from a company called Suspect Technologies, which is based in Cambridge. And the emails that we obtained from the Plymouth Police Department show years of correspondence between the CEO, Jacob Sniff, and the chief of police in Plymouth. And what they show is that, first of all, Sniff, the CEO of this company, acknowledged while he was trying to sell this product to the police that it may only about 30% of the time. He also said this technology would be great. You could install it in all public buildings, on the surveillance cameras in schools, in the library, at City Hall, at the police station, and it would enable you to create a hot list of all people who are wanted by the local police. So maybe people who have bench warrants for not paying their parking tickets, maybe people who have child payment issues, child support payment issues. You could put all of their faces in this system, and then anytime they walked past a camera in a public space connected to this technology, the police department would get an automatic alert. I don't think it takes a genius to figure out how that could go very wrong very quickly, especially when the technology only works about 30% of the time. That means that you potentially be having random people guilted by the police, tackled and arrested in the library and the public schools and City Hall when they're going to try to pay the parking ticket that they may owe for, because a police officer has gotten an alert like this on a system telling them that they are wanted for some crime. These companies do not have any interest in the public interest. They are for-profit enterprises that want to make a buck, wants to get rich off of selling this technology to government agencies. And unfortunately, there's a lot of money available there in part because of the federal government. So for years, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice have made literally billions of dollars available to state and local governments to buy all sorts of surveillance technologies. And these companies know that. It's a bonanza for them. There are a bunch of McMansions all over, suburban Washington, D.C. and Virginia and places full of people who have gotten rich off of this surveillance bonanza in the post 9/11 period, and that happens across the country. So we're seeing, this startup in Cambridge, that guy wants to get a piece of this money, and these people do not have either even the police department's interest at heart, trying to sell him a technology that only works 30% of the time, or the public's interest at heart. These are for-profit enterprises that want to make as much money as they possibly can. So that's one reason why we think it's really crucial that the state legislature press pause on this technology statewide, because as those emails show, there's a real asymmetry in power between these tech companies that are staffed by people who may have computer science PhDs and who really understand the limitations of technologies like this, and then police chiefs who certainly are not PhDs in computer science, who don't have backgrounds in machine learning, who don't know what questions to ask or how to evaluate these technologies, really being sold a bill of goods that's faulty by these technology companies that want to make a buck off of the public's funds.
Yeah. And, we're talking about suspect technologies, which I'm sure many people have not heard of that company. But there are some pretty major, businesses that have deployed technologies like this and use them to the aid of governments. Amazon, for example, they have a very well-known facial recognition technology service, but they just announced recently that they would stop using it. How significant is an announcement like that coming from Amazon, that even they are stopping to use this technology, at least for now?
I think a lot of people, myself included, think that is really a PR attempt to dial back some of the criticism that they have faced for selling facial surveillance technology and aggressively marketing it to police. These companies have a lot of Black customers. They have a lot of customers who care about Black people and Black Lives Matter and the civil rights movement that we're seeing throughout this country. And they don't want to be cast as institutions that are helping the police, particularly in this political moment, harm and brutalize Black people. So they have made the very calculated PR decision to say, okay, we're going to step away from this for the time being. That is important because it reflects something that is real. The arguments that Black scholars and activists like Tawana Petty from Detroit and the ACLU and many other organizations have been making for years now, which is effectively that this technology is dangerous to all people, but particularly to Black and brown people, these companies have just acknowledged is correct. They have effectively said, you're right. There's a nationwide, outcry about violence against Black people on the part of the police. And in response to that, we are going to stop selling this technology to the police. They are, in fact, acknowledging that what we have been saying is correct. So that is very important. But what we have to be careful about is that these companies do not use their lobbying influence in state capitals, here in Boston on Beacon Hill, or in Washington, D.C., to try to push for legislation that will create broad authorization for law enforcement and police departments to use their technologies without the civil rights and civil liberties protections that we need. And that's exactly what we saw Microsoft do in Washington State, where the company is based and has a lot of political influence. They lobbied hard to support legislation that ultimately became law that is extremely dangerous and permissive and allows police to use face surveillance technology in its most dangerous forms with almost no restrictions whatsoever. Microsoft thinks that's the right rule and ought to be the law of the land. We have a very extreme disagreement about that. So we are really concerned that the companies are trying to protect their PR image by making these statements while simultaneously working behind the scenes in state capitals and in Washington, D.C. to push for lawful authorization of police use of this technology that is very permissive and would allow for all of the abuses that we're the most concerned about.
And you sort of just touched on this, but lastly, several towns and cities passed facial recognition bans months before the killing of George Floyd and the protests that erupted after that over systemic racism and police brutality. But Boston passed this ban during all this, and while they're looking at demilitarizing their police force. Where does facial recognition fall into this discussion on demilitarizing police or law enforcement?
Well, I think there's a demand among abolitionists. So, the city council in Boston, for example, received 10,000 emails from people in the community calling on them to defund the police. What is the abolitionist call? It is actually a call to reframe our society so that we do not use police to respond to people who are in mental health crisis, to respond effectively to the results of economic inequality, which are at Gilded Age levels in this country right now. And then instead, we provide communities with what they actually need and people with what they actually need to be healthy and, to live lives that, don't involve theft or physical harm to the extent possible. So we have to think about the conversation about surveillance within that framework as well. And the question in my mind is, should we be providing police departments with technology that really enables the supercharging of their racist abuse? Or should we take a step back and think about maybe we want to invest that money, actually, because these technologies are not free, in other community services? Maybe we'd rather invest those funds in summer jobs programs, for example, for young people. Or maybe we would like to even conceive of safety and security in a different way, in a way that doesn't center the role of the police, but rather centers the role of community organizations, the role of institutions like the church, perhaps in some communities, centers the role of educators and the public health system. And so we're really thinking about moving away from framing all of the problems in our society related to crime or disorder as problems that we effectively lay at the feet of the police, problems to be dealt with by creating dystopian surveillance networks like face surveillance, and start to question whether we actually need to think about public safety and security in a totally different way, in a way that doesn't center the police, in a way that doesn't center surveillance and brutality and prison and jail, but actually centers what people really need.
Kade Crockford with the ACLU of Massachusetts, thanks so much for answering all my questions. I really appreciate you giving me your time today.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, take care. And this has been Jackson Cote with MassLive, signing off.